Hello, today we're going to be working through Lab 2. Now this looks like a pretty simple assignment, and when we look back over the course at the end, this will look like a simple assignment, but there's a lot of interesting things that are going to happen here. So we're going to process a form, we're going to write a little PHP, we're going to run a little XAMPP. Today's lab is going to go a long ways towards getting up and running with PHP. So I'm looking here at the criteria of Lab 2. So there's two things that we're going to do. I've given you a starter piece of HTML, which we'll look at. I put some bugs in it just to make sure that you get a little more practice with validating your HTML because that's a good skill. And then we're going to add some things to that form, and then we're going to process the PHP, and in order to process that PHP, we're going to have to get XAMPP up and running. So if you have not gotten XAMPP up and running yet, you're not going to be able to complete this assignment. You could just publish it live on your web server, but you're not doing yourself any favors if you do that. It would be good if you could run this locally in XAMPP. It just makes everything faster. So those are our criteria. Here's what the page looks like, which isn't terribly interesting. Let me demonstrate how this thing's going to function. So when you're done, it's going to look something like that. Right? It's going to have a place where you enter your name, pick a color. I click submit, and you'll notice that it does something like that. Right? I had blue checked, and I entered Ken. You can see up here in the URL that information's being passed. That's the get method. We talked about that a bit last week. So you can see I'm entering stuff into a form, and I'm processing it, which is what we do with PHP more often than not. So let's talk about how we get from here to there. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull up the starting HTML. So this is what I've given you to work with. You've got a little bit of HTML, you've got a little bit of CSS, you've got some comments. Right? I'm just trying to show you what HTML comments look like. You can get rid of those. They don't really need to do anything. Let me show you how to validate this again, because I don't know for a fact that you did it last week. So how I like to do this is I Control A, Control C, that's select all, that's copy. Then I'm going to go to web browser. I'm going to head to validator.w3.org. And let me back out. Let's just kind of show you how it works. Sorry. Let me do this. I could work from here, but I don't mind showing you. So validator.w3.org. I go direct input, and I paste my code here. And debugging HTML is a pain. So I check it, and let's just see what I get to work with. So it says line 11 is a problem. So I'm gonna go back to my code. Visit line 11. Yeah, there's some weird meta tag that doesn't have any attributes. Fine. Alright, that's worthless. Anything you can just see with your eyeballs is fine too. Let me show you a little bit about the power of Notepad++. Notice that tag right there that's black? You know that's wrong, for sure. Right, it says from instead of form. I've done that about 1,000,000 times. So I could just fix that right now. I promise you that the validator will catch it at some point, but we don't need to make everything as difficult as possible. Let me copy that stuff again. So I just fixed 2 mistakes. Let's go visit our validator. I pasted my new code and I check it. And stray tag footer. So what is that all about? All right, notice my footer here is actually valid in terms of the syntax. However, you can't have a footer outside of the body, and the validator is telling us that. So I move it. Let me validate one last time. Sorry, I'm a little slow, right? I'm still in a sling. Really haven't made any improvement, but it doesn't cost us too much here. So I validate, and I have no warnings or errors to show. Alright, so now this is a valid starting point. Like I said, if you wanted to wipe out these HTML comments, I don't think that's a bad idea. So I'll wipe them out. It doesn't matter to me. Alright, so now I think the appropriate thing to do is let's look at the specifications. You probably should have started by looking at those, but I'm doing this with you so I can tell you some of it. So fix the HTML, set the action to process lab 2, set the method to get, add a submit button, add a set of radio buttons. So I can't type worth anything, so I'm going to do the old pause the video and just magically show you everything complete in a minute here, and that's probably good for you because you don't need to watch me type 4 or 5 words per minute. So I'm going to pause the video and I'll show you what the form looks like once I've added all of those things, and we'll talk through it. Alright, so I'm back. You can see I've got this file. I called it lab2 complete just because I need to you should just be doing lab 2, right? I don't actually care what this file is called at all. Couldn't matter any less to me because you're just going to link to things through your nav bar. But the difference from there to here is nothing up in here. Now, some changes I made is I made the method get. Like I said, we're going to be passing information with get. In a form like this, there's no reason not to use get. You could use post in reality, but we're using get. Trust me, it's much easier to debug. And our action, so I said your action needs to be set to process lab 2. This is a script which we're going to write, which doesn't exist yet. Now in reality, I don't really care what that's called. Just make sure that the action of your form corresponds to whatever the name of the script is that we're going to create in a minute here. I mean, there's no reason not to call it process lab 2 because I don't know what else you would call it. But it doesn't really matter, just so long as you know what it is. I also want to mention that when you are naming your scripts, no spaces, everything's case sensitive, so camel casing is a good idea. So we added that. This didn't change. Now one thing I did add is this big option select right here. You should be familiar with the syntax of that because we did it last week. So it's a big old select container tag. It does need a name, right? Because when you're going to be passing this information from a form to a script, that name's important. And the value is the underlying piece of information that you're passing. That's what shows up on the buttons. Now notice that I did this pick one and like a value XXX. There's a lot of ways you could do this. You could just pass nothing like that, but I'm just trying to be explicit, so I put something silly in there like XXX. You don't have to do this, right? Like another way of handling this would be to quite simply just not have that first option. I'll show you what the result is. And on the web, you'll see a mix of both, right? Sometimes it'll just default to blue, and sometimes it'll default to pick one. I don't actually care what you do there. I was just showing you that because it is kind of common, and I'll show you kind of where that fits in a minute here. Other things worth pointing out. Notice that I'm putting line breaks after the inputs. I don't actually care what your form looks like. Your form doesn't need to look like mine. But I did a line break there. I did a line break there. And the other thing that we had to add to this was a submit button. The raw file I gave you, that was technically an error. I mean, I guess it wasn't an error in the sense that a validator caught it. But there's no way you're going to have a form without a submit button. And that is the form, right? Nothing terribly interesting. That's just pure HTML. So let me show you a really important part of this. All right, so I would expect you all can get to this point without any problems, but here is an interesting step for you. Very, very important. All right, so like I said, you need to have XAMPP up and running. Let me shut down XAMPP and start it up and kind of show you that process. All right, so this is a big, important part of the video. So I've got XAMPP installed on a flash drive. I kind of tried to encourage you to do the same thing. So here's my flash drive. Now it's not, like I don't need to do this yet, but I'm telling you it's a good idea. So I go into XAMPP. If I want to start it, I'm going to go into this XAMPP folder, and I'm going to double click on the control panel. Notice nothing's running by default. I'm going to start Apache. I always start MySQL as well, because more often than not you are using it, but you don't need it. I mean, you could start it, you could not start it, it doesn't matter. Alright, so now Apache's up and running. Now, that's one part of this. The other thing is, let me show you how this is organized. So anything that you want to actually, if you have got PHP and you want the PHP to actually run, you need to put it in your htdocs folder. None of those other folders will work for PHP. So I go in here. Now, I'm telling you right now that if you just put things in this folder, the PHP will run, but you're going to create so many things in this class that you need to get organized. So what you should do is create a folder in here, and you should call that folder whatever you want to call it. I called mine Lab2 133, which is a horrible name, but organization's not so important for me because I literally throw this stuff away like every time I finish it. But you should give it a decent name. Again, this is a Linux environment, so no spaces, everything's case sensitive. You should at this point create a folder inside of htdocs and give it an appropriate name. Alright, so once that happens, what you need to do is take this thing that you just did and go File, Save As, and you need to save it in that folder. Right, if you save this just on your somewhere else, anywhere else, if you save it anywhere outside of this htdocs folder, it's not going to work. So save it there. You can see I already did that. It doesn't matter. Fine, I'll overwrite it. So that's a really important step, and that's one of those things that isn't going to make a whole lot of sense for a while, but you'll understand exactly why we're doing what we're doing eventually. So we did this page, wasn't terribly difficult, and we took this page and we put it in our htdocs folder. Well, technically a subfolder of that. Now, let me show you how things work. So now what we need to do is we need to create a form to process this. Now this is going to be the work. And so for this, I wish I could sit here and write this with you, but it's going to take 20 minutes if I do that. So let me just show you what I did do. So I'm just going to jump to the complete form. So here's how this works. When you press the submit button, what do I want to happen? And you saw what happens, right? It's that weird little page which says hello Ken in blue or green or orange. So here's how I made that page. Again, this is more often than not, I don't mind just jumping to the completed example, but this one's going to be kind of tough. So let me show you what you're looking at. Right? Probably a lot more than what you thought. So let me talk you through this solution. So anytime that you're going to write actual PHP, which you want to be processed, you're going to do this opening PHP tag. There are 3 types of PHP tags. There's short, and there's regular, and there's long form. You should do regular form. In reality, sometimes you can get away with doing short form, and you can always get away with doing long form. So I'm just saying, if you ever run across a different opening PHP tag, forget about it. Just use this one. This is the one that is most accepted. So that's literally a left angle bracket, question mark, PHP. It opens here, and it closes here. That is good old-fashioned, pure PHP in there. So this is just, it's going to require a leap of faith, but you're just going to trust me on this for what it is. This right here is a variable. So when you declare a variable in PHP, we don't give them types or anything like that. Just anything that starts with a $sign is a variable. So that's a variable called MSG. That's an abbreviation for message. I set it equal to nothing, which is an empty string. Trust me, that's just the way that you have to do this. So let's just forget about the PHP for a minute, and let's just go look at the HTML now. So my HTML goes from there to there. It's got some similarities to just a boilerplate, right? It's got an HTML tag, a head, it's got a title. For the style, I've just got 3 classes that I created and a little styling for the footer. The body of my page is pretty weird, right? It just runs from here to here. It's got a footer, and it's got a single echo. I just want to point out, notice that I'm shooting out the message right there. When you say echo, that is kind of like the word for print in PHP. Most PHP doesn't produce any output. When you write the word echo, it means, hey, spit that out on the screen. We'll look at that later. But I just wanted to point that out because you see that MSG variable and that MSG variable right there? That's what that represents. This MSG is representative of the thing that's going to get displayed on the page. And the reason you need to initialize it to something is if you don't, you're going to be trying to spit out something which was never initialized, and that's not going to work. That doesn't make sense? Just take my word for it. Well, let's go look at the PHP. So my PHP runs from here to here. So I've got an if block, right? If else. So this is really ugly to read, but I'll tell you what it means. So one of the things that I had you read about this week was like a empty and is set. Those are variables, or sorry, they're functions which are used to check for the presence of something. So see this $_get. I talk about that a lot in the learning videos for the week. If you haven't done the learning videos, this is the point where you should realize that you are probably in over your head. So make sure you look at the learning videos for the week. That should help. So when I say $_get, square bracket, name, that means I'm expecting something to be passed to this form or to this script with a name of that. So notice this right here, get and name. Well, that's where that comes from. So I'm saying if there was something passed via the get method with a name of name, or that's not empty is a good way of saying that, and there was something passed called color, then go into this if block. Otherwise, go into this if block. Right? So simply what you're doing here is you're checking to see if if those two pieces of information were submitted. If they weren't submitted, I say something like, you are missing some information, please go back and complete the form. I can't wait for a better way to handle this. There are better ways to handle this, but those are a ways off, honestly. I want to show you what happens if I just open up this form straight up. You might learn something from this. Actually, I'm just kidding. Let me show you something else. All right, so I do Ken, I do green, right? This is that first one. When I press submit, I'm calling that second form, and it says hello Ken. Notice there's something up there called name equals Ken and color equals green. Do you see that? Name, color, those are variable names. That's where this whole thing, so those things were both not empty, so I kind of did my thing, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. If one of those is missing, I'm going to get that weird message. Let me show you what it looks like when one of them's missing. Like, for some reason, if you went in here and you just didn't submit a color, like I literally just edited that by hand, well, you could probably guess what's going to happen if I press enter. You are missing some information. Please go back and complete the form. I can't wait for a better way to handle this. Do you see how that works? Either both of those variables are there and the form does what it's supposed to do, or I'm missing something and I get that weird message. And you can see what's happening now. Like I said, if you haven't looked at learning videos for the week, I don't expect that this would go very well, but in the learning videos for the week, I talk a lot about variables and getting and is sets and such. So that's the scariest part of this. And so that right there is pretty horrendous syntax, but that's the way that you get a variable using the get method. Post is similar. So the next couple lines, so this line here is I'm creating a variable called name, and I'm setting it equal to whatever was submitted via the get method with a name of name. And I'm creating this CLR variable, and I'm setting it equal to whatever was passed with the get method with a name of CLR. And here's that message variable. And I say, and so I'm creating an H1, right? That's just a good old-fashioned HTML tag. I'm assigning it a class, right? Class is, for those of you who are new to CSS or newer, a class is just a way to style something. So I say the class is equal to CLR. CLR is that variable right there, so that you know based on the previous form, that CLR variable is either set to green, red, or blue. So the class of that H1 is either red, green, or blue. Right? Do you see how I use that there? There's also another and also I splice in another variable right there. So I say hello, variable name nm, and nm is whatever the heck was submitted. So hopefully this makes some sense now. It's not a lot of code. It is pretty scary looking though. So just to recap, either those two variables are there and you get the correct message, or they're not there and you get the error message. So the other kind of fine point here, which is, I did something good here, but it's kind of hard to understand. So this is a string, right? Strings are wrapped in quotes. Oftentimes you're not allowed to put a string or a variable inside of a string. Like in many languages, they would say like the end result would be class equals $CLR. But notice that $CLR does get translated into the literal variable, like blue or red or green, and this doesn't. It's not going to say nm. It's going to say can or whatever that variable was. That only happens because I'm using double quotes. Now, normally when you're doing strings, you have a choice of using single quotes or double quotes. If you use double quotes for an assignment like this, then the variable names will get resolved to their actual value. I'll show you what I mean by that. I mean, you saw that it works, but if I do single quotes, it actually has a dramatic effect on the product. show you. I'm going to save that, and let me refresh that page. And it does that, right? You see what it did? Like, it missed on the... It wasn't able to figure out that NM, what it actually meant. So double quotes are a really good thing to use in PHP. In almost every other language, it doesn't really matter what one you use, but in PHP, you should use double quotes if you've got variables in there. Let me show you what the source code looks like here, because it'll be kind of funny. Do understand that when you're writing PHP, the PHP eventually is going to get translated into HTML, so I view the page source, and here's the document. Right, notice there's no PHP up there. So PHP does not get sent back to the browser. It's processing, which happens on the back end. But the result of it is, right, there's that H1, right? And it says hello, or it says class equals $CLR, hello $NM, which is not right. Let me close that, let me fix that. So remember, double quotes is what you want here. Now, I'm not saying you can't do this with single quotes, because you can, but if you choose to use single quotes there, then you're going to have to use concatenation around the variable names, and that's just not easier. It's definitely harder. So let me refresh this, show you how it should work. I'm going to view the source again, so I right-click, view page source, and you see how that turned out correctly now. So that's the difference between single quotes and double quotes. There's not like a... There's not a hard, fast rule about one of them always being right and one of them always being wrong, but as you can see, that's a pretty good reason to use double quotes when you are assigning a string value. Also, I can show you a little bit about echo here. Right? I didn't write that, but where that comes from is, like I said, when you write the word echo inside of PHP tags, it means you've got a variable name and you're going to spit it out on spit out the contents of that variable on the screen. Also notice that I just busted into and out of PHP real quickly just for an echo. And a lot of people, this is always one of those things I have a hard time wrapping my head around because I've written so much PHP in my life, but people oftentimes about this, at this time in the class, they ask, well, where does the PHP go? You know, should it be at the top, at the bottom, in the middle? And there's no answer to that. It can be all over the place. You could go in and out of PHP 40 times in a page if you wanted to. Generally, how I do it is I try and write all the logic and processing at the top of the page, just because more often than not what you're doing is setting up some variables, such as this one. And then down here at the bottom, I do the printing of those variables. There's no reason you couldn't take this whole chunk and put it down here. It's just kind of confusing. Most people do try and take their logic and put it up at the top. It's just a decent way to organize your code. If you want to play around with different ways to organize this, then you should. That's the only way that you're going to learn it. But so I go in and out of PHP right here. This also says a word about the scope of PHP. It's all global. So if I declare variables up here in this block of PHP, it is most certainly available down here. You don't really need to worry about scope very much in the context of a page. You're allowed to go in and out of PHP as much as you want. I almost forgot to talk about these classes right here, because I know some of you aren't too savvy with CSS. So in CSS, there's kind of 3 ways that I can think of to create rules. You can style tags, like you can say my H1s are all have these properties. You can create IDs and you can create classes. When you write dot something, that's called a class. When you write hashtag or pound symbol something, that's called an ID. A class is a rule which is meant to be applied to many things. An ID is a rule which is meant to be applied to one thing one time. Now, given that this rule right here is only applied one time, an ID would have been fine. I could have done that. I could have made all those dots into pound symbols, and then that would say ID instead of class. But I just made a design decision there. That's how I chose to style it. There's other ways you could have done this, and I think that's everything that needs to be talked about. Your solution doesn't have to look exactly like this. You should play around with it. But that's how I did it, and I think that's probably the most simple way to do it. Let me show you the other very critical part of this. And that is, with this file, you need to save this in that same folder, right? So put it in your htdocs folder, in your lab2 folder. And that's the only way that this is going to work. Now what I mean by that is this is PHP. If you try and open up PHP in a directory which is not like a public HTML folder, it's just not going to render at all. Let me show you what I mean. So let me take this and try and open it up in Chrome, I guess. I'll show you how this works. There's an interesting piece of it. And you might already know what I mean by that. Oh, that didn't do. Chrome is too smart. Let's try IE. There we go. This looks... Actually, I don't know if that's going to work. So it's not even opening it up as a web page. Alright, let me... Sorry, this is getting a little clunky. I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to illustrate this to you. Let me try another one in Firefox. Can I do that? Okay, there we go. Good. Alright. So I opened up the file in Firefox, and you see what it did? It's like this weird combination of garbage. It kind of looks... right? It's like, hello, NM, else, you're missing some information, and it's kind of showing up, kind of not. The best way to show you what's happening is if I right-click and show you the page source. You see how everything's there, right? All that PHP showed up. But do you remember when I showed you the real, actual live page right here? And the PHP wasn't showing up? This is all, it's an Apache issue. So what you need to do, let me show you. Sorry, it's confusing because I'm closing tabs like crazy. Let me just show you that again and show you how you fix it. Sorry for rambling. It's just hard. Like I said, this is a really interesting lab because there's just so many issues that kind of come up with it. So I'm going to run it in Firefox. Right, it doesn't work. So here's the thing you always have to do when you're testing something in XAMPP. So step 1 was put it in that htdocs folder. Step 2 is go up to the URL here, and you see all this junk up through htdocs. You have to replace that with localhost. Right, I leave the /, so it's localhost / the name of the folder and then the file. And I go here, and now it doesn't look right, but there's no garbage on the page. The reason it doesn't look right is you remember those variables which absolutely had to be submitted, otherwise I get this weird message. I'm telling you, this isn't so bad. So let me go all the way back and show you the whole deal. So here's this lab. If I run this in Firefox... Right, here's the lab, the first part with just the form. Notice how this renders just fine. But I should switch this stuff to localhost. Press enter, nothing happens. And the reason it doesn't matter here is there's no PHP here yet. But once I go to once I actually submit this, it's going to work, right? And so I'm not going to get the error message because the data is there. The PHP is getting processed because it is localhost. The only thing left here to talk about, which I think is kind of interesting, completely a design flaw, I guess. But remember when I did pick one and I did XXX? Well, the class of the H1 is going to be XXX, and that just doesn't work. If I wanted to deal with that, here's what I figured. I figured I would write just one little thing just so you can kind of see me reason through something. So if you wanted to make sure that that XXX value didn't count, what I would do is I would have to write some kind of a check in here. Something like, say, if $CLR is equal to XXX. So when I'm just writing a literal with no variables in it, I don't hesitate to do that in single quotes. It doesn't matter. And I will say something like... So I don't know what I should do here, honestly. Should I display the message, or should I just pick a random color like, CLR equals pink, and write another class for pink? Like, I don't know, right? It's not clear what's supposed to happen in this situation. You might also notice that my typing is not that horrible. Well, if I set the keyboard on my lap, it works okay, but it's pretty brutal. All right, so I don't know what's supposed to happen if you don't make a choice. I guess I could yell at you, display some kind of an error message, maybe kick you down into here or something, and I most certainly could do that. or I could just pick a random color. I just thought I might be able to teach you a little bit about how this process works by doing something silly like that. So let's have a look at that in practice. So remember, here's that color XXX. And constant pink. All right. Oh, yeah, sure. Let's debug. Remember, another thing that we were talking about this week was notices, warnings, errors. So notice that if you have something that you're doing wrong in PHP, hopefully you get an error for it. So it's saying, hey, on line 10, I did something goofy. Oh, yeah, that is weird. I meant to do that in quotes. But notice it was smart enough to figure out what I meant to do. Sorry, fixed. It is never legitimate to publish code with notices and warnings in it. So now we're all good. The other way I could handle that, just to see a little bit of programming, you're like, I don't know that makes sense. What I could do is take this message here, kind of copy this. Maybe I want to yell at him, right? Like that, I guess. But in that event, I guess I would need an else. Right, the idea of you either did XXX, else you made a legitimate decision, and I cut that, and I paste that into here, and that would be another way of solving the problem. This feels inefficient and a little clunky, but I'll show you how it works. So now if I run this page, I should get my error message. Right, so even, you see, so I just had to check for that XXX case. And that's the issue, if you will, with implementing a form like this. If you're going to have like a dummy option or a bad option, you're going to have to stop the user from making that choice. And that's the reason why people don't provide that choice a lot of the time. Because if you don't have that, then you can just set it to red, green, or blue. All right, so that was not a ton of coding. PHP has a reputation as an ugly looking language. Like the syntax is kind of hard to look at, and it's something you'll get used to. I'm telling you that it's week 2. You've seen the worst of it already for the most part. This whole $_get square bracket, that's ugly. You're just going to have to... That's about as bad as it gets, though. Right? $$ seems like kind of a clunky character to have in variable declaration, but it just doesn't get a whole lot worse than this. You'll get a feel for it. Kind of a tip that I use, at least, is when I'm writing this out, I say $_get. I literally say it to myself every time I write it, because otherwise it just looks like gibberish. But if you repeat it 1,000 times, it might be something that you can remember pretty easily. So this wasn't a ton of code, but it was a lot of me talking you through a solution. I also want to reiterate that there's many ways that you can handle things. You don't need to have that dummy option. This whole if-else block here, I mean, if you don't want to address that, you don't have to address that. Be sure to check the learning videos for the week, because this is the most I can do with what this is. And I go into some more detail on some of these things in the learning videos. If you got any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I hope that things are starting to come into focus for you a little bit. Also, make sure that you got XAMPP up and running, otherwise none of this PHP is going to be able to be processed. So good luck. I hope this doesn't pose any huge challenges for any of you. It's kind of a scary lab, but it's also very interesting. I think when you look back on this one, you're going to be like, oh yeah, that was actually a bunch of important content. Alright, so thanks for watching, and good luck.